All right. As you can see, this is the second lecture about Michael Herr. And in this case, I'm focusing on Black soldiers. I'm going to use this as the way to uh, open the discussion of African Americans and the way that they, the way that Vietnam functioned for them in many ways. It's a complex topic, and like most of these topics, there's a lot more here than there's a lot. So African Americans, starting with this first thing, have fought in just about every conflict that America has had, whether it's the Civil War, where there were Black soldiers and all Black units in the North, although racism persisted and officers were always white, or the war against the Seminoles in Florida, or other Native peoples across America. Black soldiers were recruited. As screwed up as it is, war, and this is a very difficult thing to say, and I know that a lot of people would fight with me about this, and that's fair enough. But war has generally been good for Black soldiers and for civil rights in America. In general, the ones who survived, obviously, and who weren't thrown under the bus as disposable troops, came out, the overall position of Black soldiers after wars has been an improved one. There's a whole field of study on this in itself, as you can imagine. Basically, race relations at war in America is just enormous. Whether it's African American or Latinx or Native American, or Aboriginal American, if you prefer, the military has the function of the military as a tool. Let me just move this freaking window here. The function of the military as a tool for basically civil rights has been examined extensively, and it's not an easy picture in the sense that it's not a simple picture. Each of the major wars in the 20th century has had an enormous effect on Black communities, not just the number of people who were killed, but the way that African Americans perform nationalism and the way they perform Blackness, and the way that those performances were accepted or not by the white populations around them. In World War I, for instance, which is, remember, 1914 to 1918, now more than 100 years ago, was staggeringly important for Black soldiers who were barely tolerated in the United States because, after all, effectively, slavery really had been permitted to persist under Southern sharecropping laws and because of the Jim Crow laws, which forbade interracial marriage. It produced the African Americans sitting at the backs of buses, not being allowed into diners, not being allowed into motels, all kinds of very basic things. Having segregated water fountains, all those sort of horrific things, which it just looks like it's basically slavery by another term. You couldn't quite own a human being, but there are many ways in which Southerners left to their own devices made sure that they effectively did. So what Black soldiers found, for instance, when they went to France, was that the French didn't really care about whether they were Black or not. They were like, "Oh, you're Black." And the results were literally revolutionary and produced the incredible race riots in the summer of 1919, which was dubbed Red Summer because the riots were so bloody. And you can see that's why it's so incredibly aggravating to have 100 years later. It's not the same, it's not the same situation, but boy, it's all too similar in so many ways, that this what has happened this summer, um, and the whole need for Black Lives Matter and people's the persistence of white supremacists or racists who may not be white supremacists, but they're racist nonetheless, saying, well, all lives matter. It's like, that is not the point. And we had this at Western. We had when Black Lives Matter began a few years ago, because of some of the extra legal shootings or apparently legal killings of usually black men by white policemen. After Trump was elected in 2016, signs that all lives matter showed up on Western, and there were plenty of signs posted right on campus. They were taken down, but they still appeared, right? So, in good old southwestern Ontario. So, the idea that any of this is over is one of those things which it's like, no, absolutely not. It's not over at all. It's not over in America. It's not over in Canada, really. And I think probably any ex-colonial nation, a nation of colonialists. So that includes Britain, France, Germany, and so on. As with but this is, I'm focusing on America. As with other Americans exposed to continental culture, many refused to come home and became exiles after the war. African Americans learned that they were equal in the eyes of the French and in other continental nations, where they were treated, if they weren't treated as equals, they were certainly treated as human beings, which didn't happen in America. When they did come home, instead of going to the South, many traveled to New York and were at the heart of the boom and the creation of Harlem, the first Black city in America. And this is really when Harlem comes into its own, which is so important. And this is why, if you've seen Boardwalk Empire, which is about prohibition, and so basically the 20s, when America passed an amendment against the production and consumption of alcohol, one of the very fine little sort of stories, it's not little, but one of the major stories in Boardwalk Empire is the story of Chalky White, who is played by an important figure and actor from The Wire as well. And he is a Black man in Atlantic City and then in Harlem. So when they did come home, as I say, they went to Harlem, and the race riots that came about because there were leaders like Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association. And Garvey was a charismatic leader who can be seen in juxtaposition to W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois who wrote a very influential book called The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, was much more conservative than Garvey. And so you can see the reappearance of, ironically, these two figures reappear quite magically in some ways. I mean, it really is astonishing to look at the way that there are two figures that are going to reappear in the 60s who will represent the same fundamental points of view. Du Bois ultimately founds the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is still very, very important in the United States. It's still the sort of what you would call, I suspect, sort of the centrist African-American organization that speaks for the middle class and for a position which many African Americans can sign on to. It's not left-leaning, particularly at all. So Du Bois produces this strain of politics. And he can be connected then to Martin Luther King, where King, despite his revolutionary status and despite the incredible importance that King has in the civil rights movement, fundamentally, by the time we get to 1968, when King is assassinated, has been eclipsed by Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X is much closer to the Marcus Garvey figure, and Malcolm will be much more intolerant and much less patient, much more. They're very, very different people. I mean, King, is a theologian. He's a doctor. He's a doctor of theology. He's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And Malcolm X was a criminal on the street who becomes a Muslim, and basically puts an enormous amount of energy and strength into the Black Panther movement and so on. The soldiers and other African Americans who migrated to Harlem took part in what is known culturally as the Harlem Renaissance, which was a remarkable flourishing of Black arts of all kinds: music, dance, writing, theater, in the 1920s. And there are whole courses in the art that comes out of the Harlem Renaissance, because it's just so incredibly vibrant and creative and productive. And these different takes on how to bring about social justice for African Americans are going to keep on reappearing. But as I say, for our purposes, I'm going to draw a line pretty much straight from Du Bois to Martin Luther King, and from Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X. And Martin Luther King will call on the white population and the courts to bring about civil rights, and Malcolm will call on the militant Black Panthers. He will refuse white people entry into the Black Panther movement. He said, no, this is for the brothers and sisters only. And this is obviously a little tiny summary of an enormous, it's not a chapter of history. It's like, this is